And now, following the presentation of Shuhei, I'd like to look at a more comprehensive view of through assessments to better inform a treatment approach. And to do this, it's always good to first look at the individual's safety risk to self and others, and just knowing that and knowing so whether or not he does have the psychological capacity to be able to handle therapy. As the therapy that I present here requires emotional discomforts as part of the work, and just visiting emotionally distressing discomforts as part of the work is what I mean. Um, and so overall, because he's confined in prison and he's getting monitored throughout, the risk to self and others appear quite low. And also in his writings and just seeing how it's more reflective than homicidal when he writes about his grandparents in the program, the juvenile program that he recently dropped out of. It seemed less homicidal. And then further, Minnesota multiphasic personality inventory can help confirm his general mental health and his cognitive ability. And any kind of salient areas to follow up, it might pick something up where maybe a certain kind of symptomology that's pointing to a certain disorder that requires further follow-up, further testing. But so far, it didn't pick up any kind of clear personality disorders. And despite Shuhei's child abuse experience, would have otherwise increased his propensity to develop a personality disorder, and it didn't indicate as such. So he does indicate some maladaptive coping tendencies, such as social withdrawal, that sustains across his lifespan. And also, even though he does experience some dissociative symptoms, such as temporary amnesia, altered perceptions of environment, such as waking up in his cell suddenly and asking where he is, it does not appear to be indicative of any acute stress disorder, ACD. And some of the criteria to meet that is that if his symptoms did sustain only within that period, and after that period he didn't have these acute symptoms, then it's actually it does indicate that he did have the acute stress disorder. However, because he still has these symptoms and it's kind of in a way delayed onset past those 30 days, this points to post-traumatic stress disorder, so PTSD, and specifically with the dissociative subtype as confirmed by the Clinician-Administered PTSD Scale, which he does meet the symptomologies of, such as the intrusive re-experiencing of trauma as housed in nightmares, hyperarousal, and avoidance and numbing response. So an overall, Shuhei's presentation of PTSD is complex due to his prolonged exposure to childhood neglect, endangerment, and interpersonal trauma before his recent major traumatic event of murdering his grandparents and being imprisoned now. And throughout gathering this assessment, we're having our sessions, right? So built into these sessions are unstructured clinical interviews that I'm trying to determine, the type, the severity of Shuhei's symptomology is based on victim variables, even. So some of the strengths that he has and kind of how he got this far. He's been highly resilient despite all these major traumatic events he's experienced through life. And looking at also, what happened to him. So the stressors outside of him had been heavily chronic throughout, leading to a very complex traumatic experience for him. And further, any other things that could have otherwise buffered the impacts of trauma, such as a supportive other caregiver grandparent, a father, they weren't as emotionally or physically available to him. And also implementing the trauma and attachment beliefs tab's inventory actually suggested maladaptive core beliefs that others aren't safe, that he's solely responsible for murdering his grandparents, that further sustains his traumatic symptoms, and it's not adaptable to the current realities in prison, especially when he is with others. And for him to kind of not, be able to interact with peers based on these beliefs would prolong his traumatic symptoms, is what it suggests. And Shuhei's readiness for change is indicating pre-contemplative. And so that could look like him, kind of sussing out therapy, like, who am I? What's the purpose of this? What's his beliefs on changing how he feels, right? Does he believe it's possible, right? And, making this more difficult in his pre-contemplative state of mind is that he's, mandated to be here. And he, and so that kind of further complicates, and his possible engagement for therapy. And additionally, because of his quiet demeanor, it's going to be a lot more difficult for me to establish any kind of additional information to confirm his readiness. So I really kind of need to trudge carefully and ask the right questions, approach him, pace, slowness, and work on slowly developing that rapport and safety with him first and foremost. And finally, looking into Shuhei's case conceptualization altogether. So for his presenting problems, he does present with post-traumatic symptomologies. And for the current precipitant, when faced with the unescapable reality of upcoming transition to adult prison and the internal changes that follow, he drops out. He experienced, and this could be that he's experienced what's likened to a transitionary cliff that a lot of youths anticipate prior to adulthood. And for his current precipitant, as he's just starting to confront the realities of his criminal actions, he's having these dreams and he's writing about it. And further, he's experienced insufficient opportunity to develop his social skills due to his, he's reclusive, and it prevents kind of any opportunities for Shuhei to practice and relate to others, and thereby further solidifying his unaltered beliefs of insecurity with others, and that would be continuing his precipitant. And as for pattern maladaptive, it's kind of shown through his response to insecure threat. Shuhei would either passively withdraw or blindly obey to these demands. So quite extremes, at the cost, like to abide to others at the cost of his own needs. And it's been clear that through his childhood and just being on the streets and being impoverished, oftentimes mom would party a lot, leaving very little money for food. Shuhei experienced malnutrition throughout development. So it's not really possible to know the extent of how it's really did impact him biologically. But there is strong indication of epigenetic mechanisms that traumatic exposure during critical sensitive periods likely influenced his prefrontal and cognitive development. And also, interestingly, Shuhei's innate need for proximity to his mother may be part of adaptive mechanism of what's called an inborn reward system to seek protection. So that could be a little intermix of biological and psychological predisposition that could explain his psychological presentation to date. And Shuhei's experiencing of child abuse, witnessing IPV growing up, and his mother's ongoing exploitation of others likely formulated his beliefs that dysfunctional relationships and him staying in one is quite normal. And he does experience a bit of ambivalence with his volatile, detached mother and unavailable father. And these are technically should be and ideally should be the main caregivers that shape our attachments throughout our life as a child. And it kind of shown in at one point, Shuhei was wrestling with the idea of wanting to oblige by his mother and being near his mother, and her wanting to leave a child welfare program. But then at the other end, he was doing really well. He was, the worker was really good to him, like introduced him to an educational program. He was making friends, or possibly making friends. But so this kind of ambivalence that he kind of wrestled with, knowing that going with his mother is a bad thing for him, and then wanting to stay, which would be a good thing for him. So these kind of ambivalent decisions he had to wrestle with as an example of his ambivalent attachment and psychological predisposition. And Shuhei's overall, what perpetuates his problems is that his passive demeanor overall further exposes him to vulnerabilities to be continually exploited. We can imagine the dangers of this that would continue to happen in adult prison, let alone prison life. And so furthering into case conceptualization, we look into cultural aspects. So in terms of Shuhei's cultural identity, we see that he's strongly obedient, and that identifies with Japanese collectivist values, almost perhaps in a sense like an imperialistic demand for absolute obedience that he's kind of meeting, which translates to domestic expectations of a child towards a parent. So that I could see as part of his cultural identity, and an explanation further on Shuhei's East Asian cultural influences also emphasizes, mental health needs aren't as important as opposed to collective whole. And this alludes to not a lot of opportunities to express one's individual affect. And Shuhei's passive personality fits the sociocultural role of a man's responsibility to protect his family. And, he's encountered opportunities, like I've mentioned, to escape his mother's toxicity through child welfare program, but he still chose to stay with her out of loyalty to protect. And now moving into aspects of treatment. In terms of patterning, we're noticing that through his writing, he feels most connected and safe. So perhaps this points to an aspect of therapy, a narrative therapy that he might be a good fit for. So the treatment will focus on Shuhei's emotional safety needs and unprocessed traumatic events with high caution. And this could be achieved through more adaptive coping skills and altering maladaptive beliefs to update current situation he's in. So that would be the treatment strategy. And in terms of treatment prognosis, so given that Shuhei's current environment is in prison, he's stable. It's stable, it's predictable, and safe from his abuser. This does foster a moderate to high probability of him adhering to treatment, though he did drop out of that writing program. But him being in prison, we kind of can, in a way, exploit the idea that he's constantly being monitored. There's, treatment for him. He might be more likely to adhere to it. He can't go home or run away. So that's why I say it's kind of high probability of treatment adherence, and also moderate success, just given given like that he's quite, the trust has been so, um, underdeveloped for him with others, that it's kind of hit or miss in terms of success in treatment, and learning skills, and perhaps even the belief that he could trust others. So that's a hard part. And looking into the treatment approach and rationale, again, it's what I think. And this isn't necessarily just one approach. And I can, as I'm going through this, I'm probably going to see things that I could kind of, tweak and whatnot. And again, these could be changed through the course of treatment. And so, as Shuhei's sense of safety in the world was fundamentally damaged by interpersonal trauma, he may enter treatment with suspicion towards myself. So, it's very, very important that I ensure respect focused dedication to establish some grounds for him to even trust me, to hopefully lower some of the inhibitions and guardedness that he might otherwise experience with this other foreign person, this other person that's been in his life, that he, what makes me different than the government worker who didn't stay long enough to help him. So, and it's very important that positive interactions that we do have to validate more positive view of Shuhei, to kind of address some of the self-shame he might be experiencing about himself, that kind of mimics or role models for him a way that attachment figure should have been around to support him that he did not have. So in a way, I'm modeling that for him. And as Shuhei shows little emotional expression that may be indicative of extensively repressed trauma, praising any emotional expression or self-exploration that surfaces can encourage him to expose more traumatic material that's helpful for therapy, trauma therapy moving forward. And I should be aware of my own nonverbal communications that might influence Shuhei's paranoia of non-safety. And especially as he's been quite timid throughout his life. His basic survival skills were that he was able to communicate nonverbally or read other people's verbal cues. So he might be extra sensitive to, how I nonverbally communicate. So I need to make sure that I communicate it in a way that demonstrates that I'm safe, and to not further reinforce that if otherwise, I might help further reinforce that I'm not safe, and he might kind of retract. And so monitoring, so my ongoing monitoring of the situation requires me to also pace and titrate my interventions throughout therapy when I notice that there's parts of therapy that might be overwhelming, or what's called, we're trying to avoid overshooting Shuhei's therapeutic window that might inevitably re-traumatize him. So really careful to not re-traumatize him through the process. So there's a really fine line. As Shuhei acquired limited education, he may not have the verbal repertoire to accurately describe his emotions. So it's quite important initially in sessions that we focus on providing him with this verbiage through, psychoeducation, communication tools to do so. And developing his emotional regulation skills will be the initial focus alongside that, to prepare him for subsequent emotional processing that we're going to have to have him go throughout the course of therapy. And the use of these skills are interwoven throughout therapy. Say if there's a particularly salient moment that really depletes his emotional capacity, and, as we can draw from the extreme, the nightmares of his grandparents' murder, and his writings of his grandparents' murder, that's clearly something he's really sensitive about. And as we're working through that, it's going to be really it's going to take an emotional toll on him. So I got to be careful on how to help him balance, grounding and also the necessary work to go through that. So important I have the discretion to reframe and delay the processing when necessary. It is important to the exposure intervention is important for Shuhei for trauma therapy, and this is what it is. It's essentially trauma therapy. And it's to help him process unprocessed trauma through identifying what's called cognitive emotional activations that's essentially embedded in his chronic trauma experiences, that's further embedded deeply into his memories since childhood. So it's embedded along embedded. So we're really kind of peeling the layer of an onion to get to. And so hence the titrating of interventions. So ultimately, the treatment goal is for Shuhei to formulate a more adaptive association of his trauma that strengthens his existing resilience to overcome chronic personal problems, to adapt to upcoming transitional stress. And it's important that as we're discussing treatment goal, that he's also collaborating in this treatment goal and giving ideas as well. And especially this being not as voluntary as, not as voluntary, and he's wondering what this is all about, to create a sense that he has some skin in the game for him to want to go through these discomforts. That's going to be kind of an art that I'd kind of navigate in our discussions about treatment goals. So overall, this treatment approach and the rationale is basically a progressive activation entirely of past relational trauma memories, and in order to create new cognitive emotional connections to connect him with the internal suffering that he's now experiencing, and perhaps in a sense he's always experienced, but never fully processing. Okay, with that approach in mind, here's the specifics on the treatment plan, so how it's going to look like. So as again, Shuhei's in prison, of course, I mentioned that he's highly monitored. This is built-in containment to monitoring his safety needs, to minimize risk of harm to others and self. That's where we're going to be having treatment in, and that ensures safety throughout treatment. And Shuhei will be provided with psychoeducation and communication tools to understand his affect and arousal management skills, and learn those to replace the maladaptive coping. And should Shuhei experience sudden acute emotional intrusions, as we had to go through past trauma work and processing. So for instance, if he experiences a flashback mid-session, teaching him grounding techniques can reestablish his connection in the present with me, present safety with me. So it draws him back. And, grounding is, I think it's a really easy and a quick tool that Shuhei could access when things are really, really highly salient for him and he's quite escalated in emotions. And it's quite intuitive because it requires, just breathing, what he's already doing, right? And it'll help him kind of reestablish his focus, as opposed to, tools that might require more cognitive effort, like, reframing the situation or validating, like, oh, it's okay, kind of saying that in his own head. That might not be as intuitive as breathing just yet. I'm not sure, but maybe later on when he's been more advanced in therapy and applying these grounding techniques, we could move on to more sophisticated grounding techniques. But idea is what works for him initially for the most intense emotions, which I'm expecting him to experience the worst of when starting treatment with me initially. And Shuhei will be taught self-awareness skills through mindfulness-based breathing techniques. So yeah, again, it's intuitive. And the reason why I would choose something like this is that it's quite adaptable cross-culturally. There's not a lot of languaging involved in needing to be, knowing certain steps and whatnot. It's just requiring you to count and breathing and kind of being mindful, keeping the mindfulness in that. Um, and so as opposed to maybe more, meditative kind of techniques that might not be as, he might not adapt to as easily as just breathing. And although breathing and meditation do kind of coincide, and when you apply those, so these are actively encouraged for him to regularly practice with me in sessions, so he could do this and be tooled to know how to do this in his cell in his own time when he is to have the next hyper arousal state, especially after intrusive nightmare and derealization. And so throughout Shuhei's emotional processing and activation, he may draw out salient memories that may be extremely distressing, like I've mentioned, like details of the murder. And this, further activates risks in overwhelming his emotional capacity. So, of course, again, I will need to be alert with, I need to be aware of those situations, that further exposure needs to be temporarily reframed. And I can shift into reminding him to use grounding techniques. And also we'll have a shift into stabilizing Shuhei by using eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. So EMDR. EMDR is considered a gold standard trauma treatment for PTSD as identified by the American Psychological Association. And so essentially what EMDR does is it targets Shuhei's distressing memories through repeated downregulation of emotions and that are associated with the post-traumatic stress response. And then further, we'll look into skills training in effective and interpersonal regulation, STARE, narrative therapy, NT. So this will build off of Shuhei's existing emotional and interpersonal skills capacity. So STARE will do that first, and then he'll be ready for NT, which is narrative therapy. And so the idea is that repeated re-exposure and desensitization, we understand that it can disrupt Shuhei's learned connection between relatedness and danger. And the idea, so STARE NT exploits this idea to kind of merge kind of both in kind of relating to the past trauma and connecting them with kind of re-narrating a safer a reality that he could adapt to. So STARE NT will start being delivered through individual session with me, and just given the amount of trauma and the complexities of his case, I'm guessing maybe upwards of 20 to 30 individual sessions with me before he's ready for me to introduce him to a hybrid group setting, which a group setting will help him apply these social skills, these skills in a social setting, which is essentially where part of the problem for him to adapt into the current situation lies, right? He needs to socialize, he needs to connect with his new realities now in prison, and those that are in prison, right? He needs to learn to somehow trust and survive in that situation. And offering him a hybrid intermix of individual will help him kind of with processing in a way and debriefing. So, 1 week we could have, group session, he can apply these skills. And then the following week we can have individual sessions, we can debrief, and then alternating, and maybe at the end he can finally graduate into full group. So essentially we're trying to have him practice social skills to update his safety beliefs as he experiments this in an actual group. And so he can learn to internally believe in safety with others. And it's important that narrative therapy does involve helping Shuhei process emotional and interpersonal traumatic disturbances to identify the maladaptive beliefs. And it's needed in order to dispel of and replace with more cohesive adaptive story behind his current suffering. So why am I in this prison? What am I doing here? He's already kind of accepted and shared this, quickly agreeing that he's guilty. But as he's processing, these discomforts and this uncomfortable reality of his imprisonment, what story works for him to move forward? So ultimately, NT does re-encode a broader perspective this way, that could enhance his resilience to adapt to prison life. And then we turn to existential therapy, which is another constructivist therapy, essentially like narrative therapy, which is a constructivist approach. And some elements of, existential exploration can enlighten Shuhei to see his story as one of meaning and purpose, which can help him better accept it. And looking through this existential lens may also help Shuhei see past the trauma that embodied in his past victimization. And this embodiment may help Shuhei dispel of and move forward in more grounded appreciation in his reality, despite this lifelong confinement. And that he still has a chance to make choices that's separate from his abuser now. He no longer is, near her as much, depending if he still chooses to allow her to visit, if she's visiting. And overall, EP does enhance and could enhance Shuhei's lifelong resilience through establishing a view of a higher internal locus of control to be self-responsible and accepting the consequences for his criminal actions. And we see that as he's expressing remorse, that he's already has this strength in insight. So ET does kind of exploit that even further on what this means. Could we create a purpose out of this that kind of draws you forward? And some of the expected challenges and counterferences, and like I've mentioned before, I perhaps likely experience because of the intensity and the sadness in this story, and being able to identify these challenges and countertransferences can help me overcome them by hopefully setting ahead some solutions going before and throughout therapy. And just learning that Shuhei is a victim of prolonged child abuse, yet having committed murder on his grandparents. I can imagine on one end, I'm really empathizing himself as a child, and all the tragedies experienced. And then up until the point, he also did murder and take innocent people's lives, right? So I could see how this might trigger my ambivalent bias within myself to draw on moral judgments for and against Shuhei. And this could lead to the kind of countertransference that could develop therapeutic alliances. And Shuhei could pick up on this, and it might exacerbate his existing guilt. So because of this, I should be attuned to, any kind of shifts in internal processing, like these kind of blind spots in my beliefs, expectations, and emotions. Are they seeping into therapy? And it'll help me catch and prevent these unintentional crossings of my personal discomforts, crossing into professional boundaries. And because I'm female and I'm a mother as well, I do perhaps sense that I might, kind of have these a need to kind of rescue the innocent, and perhaps maybe some unmet needs as a mother, some of the challenges I faced as a mother too, to kind of make up for it through helping Shuhei this way. So this might lead to a temporary lapse in judgment for me to overcare for Shuhei. I can imagine myself taking this case home in between sessions, and perhaps, going overtime with Shuhei, or kind of pressing him too hard to kind of overcome something when he's not ready. So because of this, I should also regularly practice self-care ongoing to minimize this overcommitting in treating Shuhei to the extent of experiencing, like harming him, and also in turn experiencing this compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma that won't be helpful in the long run, especially if I need to, if this is long-term therapy, which I think it is. I wouldn't want to, run out of breath before I can finish completing the entire treatment. So it's kind of like running a race as opposed to a marathon, and this is a marathon. So overall, practicing self-care needs further extends to requiring myself to attend to my unmet needs and saliencies. So I might seek external counseling, and I can imagine myself necessarily like would be doing this for myself, and seeing the heaviness of this case. And it would be useful to use my resources. So checking in, having an objective consultant like a supervisor or colleague be aware of what I'm doing, and having them check in on me and my own trauma stress response as I'm going through this would be an accountability measure, I'd say, to minimize countertransference effects. So um, my supervisor would be like, okay, this, maybe a weekly consultation, one of the weekly consultations, she might discover that I'm a little bit overcommitting, and for her to remind me on, what I'm doing might be, not clinically helpful for the client. And that is kind of the check-in I needed to kind of recuperate, refresh myself, and do what's right again. So again, reminding myself that ongoing self-care is part of my ethical obligations to adhere and ensuring best practices and being responsible, especially in trauma care, due to the nature of the clients' problems and the clients themselves that we're exposed to, that might otherwise enhance the likelihood of countertransference. All right, so thank you very much for watching this case conceptualization. I hope you found that helpful.